was good to hear Phil talking about milk progesterone, because that's where I started off in terms of dairy cow fertility many moons ago. But as the years have progressed, I've gone further and further back into the animal's life and realised the importance of what happens to the heifer is actually affecting fertility in the adult cow. So what we're wanting out of a heifer is for low mortality, good growth, excellent fertility, and then after calving we want it to stay alive for a long time, produce lots of milk and conceive when we want it to and remain healthy. So that's obviously everyone's ideal. This is a simple sort of schematic illustrating the kind of economics of dairy cow production. So once the calf is born, you've got the rearing costs, which gradually accumulate over time, and you don't actually get payback on the production of the birth of that animal until she starts producing milk in the first lactation. And then you can argue slightly about exactly when the break-even point is reached, but most calculations suggest that that's somewhere in the second lactation, and then after that the animal is starting to generate profit, which pays for all of this early rearing costs. So any animal that doesn't actually make it to that point will have been a net drain to the to your business rather than adding profit. So the actual time when she calves for the first time is crucial to all of this. These are some data from the Centre for Dairy Investigation, and this showed that going back to the green line a number of years ago, there was actually two peaks of calving, one at 2 and one at 3 years. In the 1990s, we seem to have been doing a bit better with a single fairly sharp peak, but more recent data suggests that there is, although the peak age at first calving is around about 26 months of age, there's this enormous tail. And yes, it's true, some people actually, although it doesn't show very well on this graph, but some people do actually have animals calving for the first time after they've reached 4 years of age. So what I'm going to talk about today is, before first calving, a little bit about breeding, nutrition and disease, and then look at the consequences for that on subsequent productivity. So if we just think about heifer fertility very generally to start with, clearly after birth she then goes through a period of time until she actually reaches puberty and starts having estrous cycles, and there are data to show that having several cycles before breeding is generally considered a good thing. Then age at first breeding is partly dependent on the fact she's got to puberty and partly on when the farmer decides to inseminate. The actual time to conception is then related to your conception rate here, and then first pregnancy is a reasonably fixed length, so that all translated to age at first calving. Clearly, if there are problems in the first pregnancy, and those are going to happen in maybe 5–10% of the animals where she loses the conceptus, then you're back to the beginning again. And the other point to note is that if the herd is trying to operate a seasonal calving pattern, then there's a window of time during which conception must occur, and if she hasn't actually got in calf during that period, then you may have to wait some considerable number of months until you hit the next breeding season. So we recently did a survey looking at breeding methods used by farmers on their dairy heifers. This was just over 100 farms who were questioned in detail, and of these about 30% were just using AI exclusively, 20% were just using a bull, and about half of them were using a combination. And I think one of the things that was interesting is that of those who were using AI, 60% were using at least one straw of sex semen, and that has been a huge really increase in the last few years. So we did one survey where we were looking about 10 years ago, 2004 to 5, and then this more recent one asking questions again and looking at fertility data from heifers. And in both of those, age at first breeding was getting on for sort of 60 months of age, but with this huge range. So some people going really early and some people leaving it, or at least some individual animals really leaving it very late. Reasonable conception data in terms of about 1.5 services per conception, but some farms are prepared to go on and on and on and on, trying to inseminate their animals before they may finally give up. Conception rates were very similar in first studies, about 66%, 67%, so that's clearly better than it is for the lactating cows, but there is still room for improvement. I don't think we even asked 10 years ago whether any of these people were using sex semen, because it really wasn't around on most farms at that time. Now 60% of the farmers, as I said, are using sex semen, and the conception rate in this recent survey was about 60%, so it was a little bit lower than in the non-sex semen. And in both studies, age at first calving, around about 26 months of age. So there are a huge number of factors that are affecting heifer fertility, and I don't clearly have time to go into all of those this morning. So the general consensus, in terms of just following on the sex semen theme, is that the pregnancy rates to sex semen are about 70% of those to unsexed semen. Some farms are using insemination AI, are using estrus synchronization procedures, and there also seems to be a general perception out there that the way that you synchronize heifers to get optimum fertility with sex semen is somewhat different from that you might use either in using non-sex semen or indeed the cows. So that's something that perhaps may come up in discussion later on. But what I'm really going to be focusing on today is these few components at the top. And nutrition and growth rate really is the most important. So these are some data taken from Van Amberg's group in the States, but very applicable still. So if you take a heifer and you feed her different amounts of nutrition and see her grow over time, what Van Amberg showed was that basically the animals all get to puberty at, give or take, but more or less the same body weight. And in the sort of typical Holstein, that's probably just under 300 kilos. So if you grow them very rapidly, they're going to get there maybe 8 or 9 months of age. If you grow them at a sort of average rate, they'll get there maybe 10, 11 months of age. But if you grow them very slowly, then they're not going to get to that magic weight and start showing estrus until quite some time later. So if you're actually wanting to get them in calf and serve them at about 14 to 15 months of age, these ones have clearly missed the boat because they haven't actually even got to estrus when you're trying to get them in calf. And one could argue that the red line actually probably isn't advantageous commercially, because feeding this extra food, you probably still don't want to serve them really very much younger than this. So really the optimum is to go for this growth rate of about 0.8 kilos. This is some data from beef heifers, but it's very applicable to dairy heifers as well, where the vet has gone along at the beginning of the breeding season and done rectal palpations and looked at what follicles are on the ovaries, what the uterine horns are like, and so on, and related that to the conception rate at the end of the breeding period. And in this particular case, they used AI for 50 days and then ran them with a bull subsequently. And perhaps not surprisingly, the ones that have got good uterine tone and a CL present, at the end of the breeding period, you've got really almost all of them in calf. Whereas the ones that hadn't got to puberty at the beginning, then only half of them have really got to pregnancy rate at the end of that time. So looking at the target weight for age in Holsteins, and this is going to vary between the different breeds clearly, as I said, puberty is occurring in Holsteins at a bit under 300 kilos at about 40% of mature body weight. And then first breeding, you're aiming for about 55 to 60% of mature body weight to have been reached. So you can simply calculate that from that if you want them to calve at 2 years, then they need to be growing somewhere around about 750 grams a day. Now, this is data that's been around for a while now that Jessica Brickell, who was my PhD student at the time, spent an awful lot of time going around 20 herds and weighing an awful lot of animals. And what she found was that there was, although the overall average growth rate overall was almost sort of spot on, but this masked a huge degree of variability. So the slowest growing farm averaged half a kilo, the fastest growing farm 1 kilo. And if you looked at individual farms, again, huge amount of variability over this same sort of range between animals growing fast and slow. And one of the things that we've been focusing on recently has really been looking at the way that people are managing their young calves. And Alana Bolton, another PhD student, has been going around 100 farms, asking farmers lots and lots of questions, and in terms of how they manage their animals and how much it's all costing them. And I'm just highlighting one of her pieces of data here, which is that in terms of milk feeding volume, that ranged from some people who were only feeding them 2 litres a day up to other people who were sort of ad lib getting about 13 litres. And if a calf's given a choice, free ad lib, it's going to go for the 13 litres a day. But an awful lot of people are feeding an awful lot less milk. And this here is really, I think, one of the most important slides that I'm going to show you. So one of the things that we measured in Jessica's study was the concentration of IGF-1, which is a metabolic hormone that's produced by the liver, and it gives an indication both of growth and general health of the animal. And what we've done here, we measured it at 1 month and again at 6 months, and we related that to the age at which the individual animals went on to calve. So the orangey ones calved at less than 25.5 months, and the blue ones took longer. And what you can see is that already at 1 month of age, the animals which were going to calve late already had significantly lower IGF-1 levels, and that was still present at 6 months of age. So this is really shown that already by 1 month of age, something's happened to those animals which is going to contribute to a delayed age at calving. So just to show you a bit of a picture, these are just 2 animals being weighed and measured. And if we focus on age at first calving, these were 2 animals on the same farm. This one was a slow-growing animal which didn't calve until she was 37 months old. This was a well-grown animal who calved at 25 months. And this one had actually got, it may be a bit low to see on the slide, but this one had actually managed to get to her second calving at 39 months. So she'd fitted in a whole other lactation before this one even got started. So apart from nutrition, which I said would probably the most important thing, the other thing that has a big impact on growth rates and general sort of health and welfare of the animals are, I mean, there's a whole host of different things that are going to affect that. And how they're managed is going to affect their likelihood of getting disease, of which respiratory disease and diarrhea are probably the 2 main problems. And I don't have time to visit all that today. But going around lots of different dairy farms, the way that they're managed within the UK at the moment is really hugely variable. In terms of how they're fed, whether it's buckets or automatic feeders, how many are in each pen, whether the pens are clean or dirty, how often they're cleaned out. So there's a lot of variability out there in terms of the management. Another student, Kate Johnson, has recently been monitoring the disease incidence on farms using detailed weekly assessments of calves using a Wisconsin scoring system, which takes the temperature and carefully monitors if they are scouring or respiratory disease. As I think most people are aware, you get most scours in the first 2 or 3 weeks of life, whereas respiratory disease is more evenly spread over the whole pre-weaning period. But what she found by actually going and looking at each calf every week very carefully was that within their pre-weaning period, nearly half of all the animals had symptoms of diarrhea at some point, and also nearly half had respiratory disease. And at the moment, I think that the incidences of these diseases are really quite underreported. And there are lots of studies that have looked at the impact of calf disease on age at first calving and later performance. So just to show you some figures, this first one showed that if they had respiratory disease in the first 3 months, it delayed calving by 3 months. Heinrichs in the States showed related antibiotic treatment of calves to delayed age at first calving. Barkmore in Spain, if they had repeated cases of respiratory disease, then they were far less likely to get through their first lactation. And a Swedish study here, again, looking at respiratory disease, in this case increasing the calving interval. So there seems to be more of an impact of respiratory disease than scours, but there is an overwhelmingly clear message that animals that are getting respiratory disease have delayed age at calving. Now, one of the other things with having this sort of widespread of the age at which they calve is that they also get there at a very wide range of different weights. And the ones that are probably haven't grown enough are at an increased risk of dystocia. But at the other end of the spectrum, you get the longer they go on before they get to calving, they tend to get much fatter, and they're calving at above average body conditions score. And there's also data to show, in fact, that slower growing animals compartmentalise their adipose and muscle tissue differently, and they're ending up putting on weight more by fat, so that you're getting animals that have got a lot of fat that are going into calving. And that affects the way that they mobilise fat after calving, and I think Phil may be coming onto this later, but animals that are mobilising a lot of tissue after they calve are less likely to conceive in their first lactation. So if we look at the data on first lactation fertility divided up by these same 4 age at calving periods, just focusing on the ones that took more than 30 months, and basically all of their fertility parameters in the first lactation are consistently worse. So they've got this higher body condition score before calving, they have a lower conception rate, need more services, take longer to conceive, longer calving interval, older at second calving. If you compare the very young ones with what we would say was probably the optimum, which is 24 months, these ones are not significantly different between them, but generally the fertility in these younger ones is slightly less, and that's probably because they're having to do more growing in their first lactation, and that may be having a negative impact slightly on their fertility. But this is a slightly complicated slide, but I'll try to explain it. So what we've got here, we've got the time at which animals reach first, second and third calving plotted against the days. So we've classified the animals in this row along here in terms of their age at first calving into these same 4 categories, so young, sort of medium, going up to old. And then we've taken those animals, tracked them through and said, when did they calve for the second time, when did they calve for the third time? And again, this makes the same point that I made earlier, that the ones that start young have actually got to third calving at 1500 days of age, whereas the ones that start late have only got to second calving at that point. So again, you fitted in this extra lactation. So, I mean, I'm not sure Marco may say more about this later, but one of the things that we think is really important in terms of looking at milk yields is that it's actually related to milk production per day of life, rather than just focusing on how much milk is made. In the past, there's been a lot of emphasis on how much the cow actually makes in the first lactation. But what you really want is an animal that goes on producing milk through her life, and there aren't too many unproductive periods, whether that's either before first calving or between dry periods between different calvings. So that pattern of having a consistent lactation is going to be better than one animal that has a very large first lactation but then can't get back in calf again. So looking, I mean, one of the worries that farmers may have is if they get their animals pregnant too soon, the heifers, that it impacts on milk production. But actually our data really doesn't support that. And the only ones that actually have a lower productivity in terms of milk production are these older calving animals. And in terms of what I think is really important is how many of them actually survive to get to a third calving within 5 years. The 24-month age group do best there. And again, these older calving animals are really the ones that are dropping away and aren't making it through to third calving. So our data was on a relatively small number of animals looked at in detail, but here's some more data from Henry Richardson's group, where he looked at this over a much larger proportion of the national herd. And here we are looking at it in milk yield against age at first calving, and again looking at milk yield over life. And you can see that the peak again is in animals calving at 24 months, and it gradually tails away as you delay first calving. But this is a fertility workshop, so this one is really the more important one, which is looking at the relationship between first calving and subsequent fertility. So here he plotted, again, this is the age at which the animals first calved, and then looking at the calving interval between the first and second, second and third and fourth lactation. So the animals that have calved for the first time round about this optimum 24-month period go on consistently over every lactation to have a lower calving interval. So it stays with them. It's not just a one-off. So the animals that have grown well, stayed healthy, calve at 24 months, are then able to go on and have short calving intervals for the next 3 lactations. So to sum up then, messages. So I think one of the things that I'm a little bit depressed about going around the dairy industry at the moment is that an awful lot of people are skimping on feeding their young calves, and you really have to get enough milk into them in those first few weeks to maximise their early growth potential. Another key time is managing the weaning transition so you don't get a growth check, and in order to make sure that the animals are being fed enough and are growing well, then it really pays to monitor the growth rates to check within your herd that animals aren't slipping behind. And it's important to reduce the disease incidence by good housing and management. So a lot of the costs within the dairy farm are associated with the heifer rearing, and I think our data and other people's really shows that if you can get them to calve at 24 months, it maximises profitability, because it not only reduces the rearing costs, but it also increases lifetime milk and calf production. So the point here is that how they're treated in those first few weeks really does have a lifelong impact on various aspects, but fertility is one of them. So final slide then is just to thank all the people who did the work and our sponsors, which are very grateful to include DairyCo in supporting some of this work over the last few years. So, thank you.